Hello, and welcome to FI for Kids, the podcast about guiding your kids on the path to financial independence and extraordinary lives. I'm your host, Dominic Delacqua. Today's guest is Greg Merritt. Greg has a bachelor's degree in psychology and a PhD from the University of Michigan in higher adult and lifelong education. He formerly held a senior level position at the University of Michigan before a life-changing health event set him on a very different course. He is currently the CEO of Informational Interviewing and Patient as Partner. Our conversation today will focus primarily on informational interviewing and how late high schoolers and early adults can learn more about possible career options before making that choice on where to spend their money and energy. Hey, Greg, it's great to see you, man. It's been a long time.
It has been far too long.
Yeah. Let's start with you just telling us a little bit about your background, how you went from a senior level administrative position at the University of Michigan to a very different life now with patient as partner and then informational interviewing. So just tell us about that.
You bet. Probably the place to start for me is always thinking about childhood. I mean, I oftentimes will walk around in this community, which is, to my world, affluent and things. So I try to always sort of put myself back in my 8, 9-year-old self. And I think about that as a person who was growing up in poverty. And though must say that when you're in that situation, you don't actually quite get it, right? So going
Mhm.
to the fire station to pick up peanut butter and bread and cheese, and in fact, government cheese, I must say, I still have this sort of hunkering for government cheese. There was something about that. But what's interesting about that whole notion is, you grow up in that circumstance, and the thing that mattered most to me, and I didn't realize sort of what the avenues this was going to create, is how much I loved school. Right. So
Hmm.
school was the safe haven. It was the place where whatever else was happening, I had a father who was an alcoholic, um, a mom who did not complete her high school diploma, was a very young mom. And so what was always a sanctuary for me was to think about what role school had. In fact, one little tidbit is that I missed exactly 2 days of school for 12 years.
Wow.
And those only 2 days were when my father died in the car train accident when I was 10.
Hmm.
Those are literally the only 2 days that I ever missed of school. And that just says something about kind of what that had sort of ingrained to me. So I was obviously pretty good at school, but the more important thing is it was the sort of thing that kept everything together, from athletics to community to connections with other people to other students. And so that has always been kind of the foundation of how I've thought about the role of education. Um, and as a college student, when you know, again, there was no one in my extended family who went to college.
Hmm.
And so I was in this place where, being the first in your extended family, I had to try to glom on to people who knew something about this. So,
Sure.
my good buddy Tim Sullivan lived next to me. My is still best friends today. He lives out in North Carolina. So Sully and I would just sort of pay attention to what is Sully talking to his dad about, and that must be what I need to do. And
Hmm.
so, making certain I took the all the admissions tests. I still remember when we got the financial aid forms. Uh, got it home. My stepdad and my mom opened up the thing and said, okay, you're going to have to do this. And so this whole notion of sort of figuring it out and being a trailblazer and somebody, it is sort of it been embedded in me, in terms of how I went about the role of education as a young person. And then probably the thing so that led me down the road of when I was in high school trying to figure out what I wanted to be. The only people I knew who had college diplomas were teachers, and so I thought,
Sure.
well, I guess I'll be a teacher because that's who I know, and I don't
Hmm.
know anybody else who has a college degree. And thought I was going to do that all the way. I was going to coach and teach, and then I got to college, and I think my junior year, I went to do my first student teaching. You're just sort of observing, and it was with seventh and eighth grade kids, and I learned in about 2 weeks I couldn't do this. This is not what- but I was a resident advisor in college, and so
Hmm.
the idea that you could actually do a living becoming part of university housing uh, sort of set in. And now I was like, oh, that's what you can do. So I sort of followed the bosses at Bradley, which is where I went to my undergrad and my master's degree, and they connected me to sort of this job placement, and that led me down the path of ultimately getting to the University of Michigan, where I was leading much of what happens in University of Michigan's housing department.
Yeah, because you were pretty high level in their housing system, right? And that's a huge university. So that was a big job.
It was a big job. Yeah, we had probably on campus at the time 15,000 undergraduates, and so I was leading 6 departments with 40 or 50 full-time employees and hundreds of students and lots of crises that took place. And so, and what's interesting about that time is I actually thought I was managing much of that pretty well. I thought I was somebody who took care of oneself pretty well, was managing stress well. And then at 46, one of those deals where you wake up in the morning and you tell your lovely bride, which I did, hey, I think I'm having a little heartburn. And she looked at me like, that's odd. You don't have heartburn. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. I think we should go to the hospital. I poo-pooed that idea saying, have some Tums, I'll be fine. But ultimately something got us into the car, and on the way down to it's about a 20-mile drive to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, which is also where I was working. I arrested in the car, clutched my chest and just sort of slumped over and was blue-lipped and pretty much out by the time she ended up just continuing to race to the hospital. Ended up about 20 minutes went on in the emergency room, where they asked her after they're doing all the compressions, all the stuff that you would do, would you like to continue? Maybe to her dismay today, who knows? But she says yes, maybe a few more minutes, and then another 10 minutes went by. Ultimately got in a rhythm, off to the cath lab where they put in 2 stents, and then to the cardiac ICU. And then 5 days later, I woke up from cardiac ICU, and they asked, sort of, did you want to go home? And I'm like, what happened? And
Wow.
ultimately was incredibly fortunate to get this gifted second life that led me to doing the stuff I do now, with this sort of patient as partner, and with doing some stuff with this informational interviewing. I think we'll get a chance to talk about as well.
Wow. That's quite the journey. So what you're doing now though is not, these are not, so to back up, I guess, grew up in poverty, did well in school, really liked school, that sort of took you down a certain path, ended up with a big successful job, successful career at a large university, and heart attack at a young age. And that changed everything. And so now the things that you're doing are not actually based on trading your time for money anymore, right? It's a very different reality since that time. So patient is partner, which that's how we
Yeah.
met. Um, and that's definitely a labor of love. And I think so is the informational interviewing. So really quite an extraordinary journey. So before we get into discussing the informational interviewing in more detail, because that's really what's most relevant to the FI for Kids, I just want to preface that with saying one of the reasons that I started this podcast is just in random conversations with people talking about FI and the fire movement. I don't know how many times I said, I wish I would have known this stuff when I was
Mm-hmm.
younger. And it took longer than maybe it should have, but at some point the light went on. I'm like, oh, well, then I should do something about that and be useful in some way. And with the informational interviewing, that's also something that I wish that I would have known when I was first going to college, because I think you kind of gave this through example in that, and I think this is common with a lot of people. Well, you know someone who does, you knew people that were teachers, and so you thought, well, I'll go that path. And then, I've known as a physical therapist, I've known I don't know how many different therapists who got into therapy because they had some sort of an injury when they were in high school and had outpatient physical therapy and thought, oh, I want to go to therapy school. And I think that's true for all kinds of professions. The problem is when you're 18 and you're first going to college, you have no idea of all the different
Exactly.
opportunities and all the huge variety of career paths that are out there. And so, how in the world do you even know what you don't know? Which gets us
Like,
to informational interviewing. So, at this point, I'm just going to put a quarter in the slot and you go and
yeah.
tell us about this.
So I think so. You're right that I thought I sort of looked at my teachers and did that, but I didn't do any of the things that you sort of just described in being curious about what other possibilities were there. Right. So remember a kid who knows no one who's gone to college. All family functions were seen as the college kid. Everybody else was doing sort of true sort of blue collar real work. Um, I remember my first full time job. I'm home for a holiday, and my uncles and aunts are talking about you know what it means to be tired at work, and I'm like, oh, I
Mm,
worked a long hours, and they look at me like, what are you doing? You're in a college and you kind of talk to people, and how is that hard work? Where they're actually literally outside doing things where their muscles hurt
yeah.
because they've worked so hard. So there's that sort of sense that I what I didn't leverage was the opportunity to be even more curious about all the opportunities that were there. So I think about informational interviewing much more about just starting the notion of how can we get young people to be more curious about what is possible. Where are the opportunities for me to sort of put my get my toes wet in sort of see, wow, what's that about? Because what I've noticed, so again, spending so much time at the University of Michigan with literally thousands of students and meeting with thousands of RAs over my 30-year career between there and Michigan State. One of the things that I would do often is try to make connections with young people to have them learn about a profession that they're interested in. And as I finished up and sort of had the heart attack doing this work in healthcare and then doing this other work, I started to think about, gosh, you know what I didn't do is give them beyond the thing. So, right, if you told me that you had an injury and that's how you ended up in physical therapy, I would find a couple physical therapists because I knew a lot of people, and I'd have you go interview them.
Hmm.
But I was missing a real key ingredient when I would do that. The key ingredient was to say, I'm not trying to just have you understand what thing you're interested in now. So, yes, go do that. But in addition, when you leave that person, ask them for two other people and a third that's not in that field at all. Right. So we're trying to have them be much, much more curious in the way in which they try to expand what's possible. Right. I will often say this to a person when I first start talking about informational interviewing. How many marine biologists do you know? Do you think you'd
Hmm.
like that? And of course, they look at you like, well, I don't know any marine biologists. Because most of who people become are people who are connected to their parents, and so their parents know people, and or their parents themselves are that, right? If we look at the trajectory of careers, they're often just because I followed my mom into medicine,
Yeah.
or I followed my dad into, pick the whatever they're in, and they may be connected, but they're often, even if they're not connected, they're adjacent, right?
Hmm.
They went into banking, I went into finance of Wall Street. That's not the same thing. When of course it's all the same. Versus having the opportunity to say. So for me, information reading was sort of twofold. One, it was to try to get people to be more curious, and the second is to give opportunities to people like me who, if you don't know anybody in college, you get the whole world to explore because you don't have parents at home who can say, why don't you go talk to our architect friend, to
Yeah.
our, it doesn't exist. There is nobody in that world. And so your world is caught in the college environment. And what I talk to particularly first year students in college now is the opportunity to think about how many alums exist across the myriad of professions that are now existing, from those who just started 2 years out to those who have just ending their career,
Hmm.
and but they're all from the University of Michigan, University of Oregon, wherever their alum base is.
Sure.
And so the more we can do that kind of work of first starting people to say, just be curious. If you're curious, that's the first goal. Because far too many people who are first year students, in fact, the first question I get asked by many 17-year-olds who I explore this stuff is, well, what questions would you ask? And the answers are almost always transactional. And that's the way in which they've
Hmm.
understood. Meaning, I'm going to go talk to Dominic about what it means to be a physical therapist to see if I can get an internship in order to work this summer so I can learn how to do that.
Right.
And that's it. That's the
Right.
reason why. That's networking as is understood. And why do you want to doctor? Well, I heard the physical therapists make good money. I mean, now we can tell them that they don't actually make that much good money. But that's actually how they think about this, right? Is that everything that's relationship with a professional is transactional and trying to get you something.
Sure. I mean, that's learning some things, but it's not the same as what you're talking about is this much more broad sense of curiosity about what else is out there? What else might I be interested in?
Correct. And the curiosity of being that human, right? So what I
Hmm.
say to every student, every person who would go into this program, your goal is to understand the person you're talking to and understand their life and the way in which they live their life so that when you leave there, so if you get a half an hour of gold with this person,
Hmm.
you're going to be able to talk about the fact that you got to know some 52-year-old who runs a business that you're interested in being in. But the goal was really to learn about them and hear about what's their best day, what's their worst day, why is that their worst day, not to try to get a internship. Now, it turns out that if students do this, because far too few 60-year-olds hear from 18-year-olds and
Hmm.
are amazed when they come and ask them about me. Wait a minute, they're not asking. So let me get this right. You're not asking for a job? No, I'm actually just sitting here trying to be curious and understanding how you got to where you got to, why you chose what you did, to see if there's a comparison about what I'm trying to learn at 18. And so questions like, if you were to be a freshman in college again, what would you tell yourself that would benefit me? What
Hmm.
advice would you give? So it's questions that start to become really about curiosity about that person.
Well, what's
And
cool about that, I imagine, Greg, is, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that two things that people are happy to sort of talk about that stuff. Because one of the things I've found from doing interviews for this podcast is people are more than happy to talk about their kids and what they're trying to teach them and where they're trying to get them to go. So I would expect in a different way, but similar, people are happy to talk about their experiences. And also, it gives them a chance to reflect on things maybe they haven't thought about for a while. And they're probably happy to share that information with someone that's younger.
they love it. In fact,
Yeah.
not only do they love it, it is actually what happens. So I never talk about this to the student who's coming to talk with me, but the reality is they will actually get the internships because if you're
Sure.
that person, you're like, holy cow, they're actually who is this kid? And let's figure out how to get them because they don't. This is not how most 17, 18-year-olds behave.
Yeah.
They don't behave curiously with curiosity of learning about me. They're curious about a lot of things, but not necessarily about the 45-year-old who seems like a really old guy now.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
them,
To
right?
them, yeah.
And so the ways we frame this really becomes an opportunity also to not tell those. So it would actually run afoul to my own principles here if I said to the person who's coming in to do information interviewing, ask these 7 questions, because that actually is not that's my curiosity, not yours. So our goal is to do a couple of things. One, we start by saying who. First question is who would you ask and why would you ask them and how would you go about doing that. So we might actually do a role play, right? So if you
Hmm.
were a 17-year-old who's interested in medicine. Uh, okay, fantastic. Uh, who would you? Who do you know? If you okay, you great. You told me your mom's friend is a doctor. Wonderful. That sounds great. Tell me how you would go about asking them to meet. Let's role play that. Let's see how you would do it. They'll often start. Well, I would send them an email. Or, really, is that the way? Do you think that would make you most successful in talking about it as an email? Maybe there's a way to do a joint. Maybe it's an email to actually ask the question, so you can actually be in person with the individual. The goal is to, why would you choose this method versus another? And so it starts to get at what their interests
Hmm.
are. And then we spend all the time thinking about, okay, let's start brainstorming questions that you care about, not ones I care about, that you care about. And so we often have to reframe some of those. Like sometimes you'll get, particularly, frankly, uh, uh, often immature 16, 17-year-old boys will ask, well, I'm curious how much they make. Like,
Yeah.
that's an interesting question, but that's not probably one that you want to start with to figure out the salary that they get this year. Let's think about other ways that we can do that. So you're trying to help them to frame questions that they care about and that they track, right? So that if you ask a series of questions, why are you asking that question? And what are you going to do with that information? Right. So I'm going to write it down. Great. What are you going to write the answer down? Why would you do that? So trying to get them to a place of curiosity means more than just I'm going to learn about you, but I'm also going to learn about how this helps me
Yeah.
think about what my future is going to look like. And so we do give them one question that they must ask at the end of every session, at the end of the first session, and that is, tell me, can you give me two other people who are in this field? So the two other people in medicine,
Right.
and one who you think I'd just be really interested in getting to know because they're interesting people in a field that's not in medicine. It has to be something far away from medicine. Could be
Different
architecture.
field. Yeah.
Totally field, which allows them. So that's the only question that we say we're going to give you and ask that everybody asks, because once they have that happening, and then we give a bunch of things on like what's the sequencing, how many of these you're going to do, how are you going to keep yourself accountable, what are the ways to assure that once you have that, how are you going to write kind of what it's helping you to do and learn about. All of those things become at the end of the process, but the real goal is to pique curiosity, like have them do it once, and then that gets them curious about, wow, old people are interesting and fun. I want to get to know more old people.
Yeah. Well, and I know you and I have talked a lot in the past about innovation, and you've talked about sort of how that works. And you actually had this project you were working on when you were still at the University of Michigan with these graduate housing suites, and you were requiring that. I think there were 7 students in there with sort of a
That's
center
correct.
area, and only 4 of the 7 could be from the same major. The other 3
That's
had to be
exactly
from
right.
elsewhere because there's research out there that shows that innovation happens when you're trying to work on a problem, and someone outside of your cohort, your group, the way that you all look at the world, sees it from a different angle, and that's where the light bulbs come on.
You got it.
So, right, asking for that other person outside of medicine in this example seems to me to be super important, because that's where they talk to that person, and maybe it's like, okay, that was cool, I like that person, but I'm not interested in what they're doing. But maybe there's something in there that lights them up that they never knew about before, and that takes them on a whole different tangent and a whole different path that maybe is where they might have never found it, or that might have been 20 years before they meandered their way around to that path.
That
So that's
it's
super cool, man.
exactly right. That's exactly. I mean, that for me is the most fun about this, right? So if you think about what happens to most young people is that they surround their circle is by where their parents' circle is, which is where their friends come from, which is where their school is. So asking outside of that circle, as you describe in sort of the Munger, the Munger Rosenthal where I was, the disciplines on the left and the right are often the things that create this wonderful light bulb innovation. In this example, disciplines that actually may be far afield, but it just create curiosity, and none of your friends know anybody in that field, and it was just the person. That's what creates this. It does where we began, which is, how do you know that you don't want something if you've never met anybody in that field?
Yep.
You can't possibly know that.
Right.
We often will do. And the reality is, if you look at most people's careers, asking virtually anybody, it is actually a rarity. My wife happens to be one that is the rarity, that when they were in 4th grade, they wanted to be a veterinarian, and she actually found the vast majority didn't know or knew what they wanted to do and shifted because of one meeting that happened in college or that happened before college
Yeah.
that put on a thing that said, oh, that's now what I want to do. I now have, and that's the whole point of this sort of information interviewing, is it creates these opportunities that otherwise you may never have had.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I completely agree with your example about Michelle. And all the people I've known over the years, I've known one who knew what he wanted to do when he was young. He was actually a college buddy of mine. He was from Colorado. He wanted to be a sports writer from the time that he was young. And he went to the University of Missouri because they were the best J school in the country at the time. And that person is Pat Forty, who's had an extremely
Right.
successful
Exactly.
sports
Yeah.
writing career.
I don't
So
think I knew that. That's cool. I don't know if I talked about that. That's great. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
No, he's great. But he's the only one that I've ever known who knew at a young age, and then pursued it and stuck with it, like Michelle.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah, yeah, but you're right. Most of us are, well, I don't know, I'm interested in this and maybe that, and you just so what you're doing, I think, is great. Um, so it sounds like then you're doing this as a service for college students. So what about can we talk about the nuts and bolts of what this might look like for our listeners out there that are not near where you are and maybe aren't gonna work with you to sort of do this, although they could if they want to. We'll get to that at the end and make sure people have your contact information in case anyone wants to reach out. But if they just want to know more about what this might look like, tell us about that.
Yeah. So if you were to think about this, let's assume it's a first year student at Bradley University, which is where I went. And if I could go back to myself at that point, if someone would have said to me, okay, here's this wonderful opportunity you have, right? There are, and particularly in today's world, you have tons of Bradley alums. You have a Bradley LinkedIn page that has all these folks. You have, just this wealth of folks whose love it is for the university with which they attended and graduated, and identify some potential people that you could interview. It might be that you start with an email, leveraging what we often don't leverage, which is the connection we have right away. And my first part of this email is, I'm at Bradley. You graduated from Bradley. We love this institution, so let's find the connection. Let's not take a lot of time. So I'm just asking if you might have 15 minutes just to share with me. You would then come up with, I don't know, in 15 minutes, you might actually have 10 questions, and there might be two that you care deeply about, that you want to be most certain that you get asked, because they're two questions that really matter to you in learning about, gosh, do I really want to be a dentist or an architect or what have you that's there? And the only way I'm going to know that more is to get to know this person. And so I'm going to begin asking that kind of stuff. And so the opportunity then is to have those questions ready for you. It'd be great that you can sit on a video conference and actually see people and watch them smile and laugh and
Hmm.
shake their head. All those things matter. And so an opportunity to say, let's start with that as a way to do this video as opposed to something that's just on the phone. If the phone's the only option, it may be the options, but the goal is to have this be, again, a chance for you to be curious about somebody who you haven't met before, but you have two things in common. The first is that you both went to the same university. The second is that they're doing what you think you might want to do. And that's your connection that you have with that individual. And so you could leverage this around, and again, you could do this in high school too.
Mm.
Seniors in high school could do this about their high school paths. You could do this outside of disciplines that are, you could do this in trades, right?
Oh,
So
sure.
who's graduated out of high school, who's a successful plumber in our area?
Yeah,
And so
sure.
there's ways to do this that is not just college oriented. There are lots of trades that you could say, who's the electrician that everybody uses now that graduated from the same high school that I did?
Well, and
Uh,
even different trades, right? I mean, to take that example of it and ask for somebody, if you think you really want to do trades, you'd like working with your hands, and you think it's going to be carpentry because that's sort of what you
yep,
know, or you've got an uncle that does that or whatever. But then talk to somebody else who is an electrician or a
that's the point.
plumber or
You
whatever, and you might
you
find,
got it.
oh, yeah,
Well, and this is actually where, again, where colleges tend to, a kid growing up who's a first generation college student, the opposite also happens, right? If you know everybody is in college and you actually want to be in trades, this is an opportunity for you to actually expand out of this, so that, because far too many college educated parents get all, oh my God, my kid doesn't want to go to college. Well, there's opportunities to actually do things that really leverage their same curiosity. It's just not in the things that you did. It's
right.
actually in the things that they're interested in, whether it's carpentry or plumbing. And the reality is, many plumbers work in people's houses who do lots of things. And if they're really good plumbers, they do good work, but they also get to know the families and learn that, hey, there's an art. I just worked on an architect's house the other day. And
Yeah.
so there's lots of ways to make these connections that take place. And so as you do these sort of questions, the goal would be the same thing you would with any other sort of organic conversation, right? You're asking them for information to help you to understand what it is that they do and who they are as a person. And so when that interview ends, as I said earlier, the only question that I would implore everyone to ask are there two to three other people who do this work that you believe would be really interesting people for me to continue to get to know, and one who's doing something that has nothing to do with what it is you do, so that I can continue to explore the multiple opportunities that exist out there for me to interview folks that matter. And if you then create a cadence of how often you'll do these, it would really help that individual student to get clear about, okay, if I do one of these every 2 weeks, is that reasonable to me? Can I really do that? How would I write down what I'm learning each time? How would I begin to shift? Because it could be the interview begins to shift from, I started thinking I was going to do accounting, and after I talked to first three accountants, I'm now actually on to marine biology, who knew I was going to do that, and now
Mm-hmm.
I'm headed down a path to do that. And it allows you over a window of time. I say this oftentimes: if you started this senior year, junior year in high school and did this all the way through the sophomore, junior year in college, and you had this wealth of information that's out there, by your junior year, you would have kind of this real good sense, very different than every other person that they're likely to meet,
Yeah.
who is going to say, oh, wow, you've done 50 interviews with people across this many fields. Gosh, and you came to a conclusion that that says this is what you want to do now. This is what you're going to pursue because your college will ultimately end. Again, doesn't mean that you couldn't continue to do these for the rest of your career. In
Sure.
fact, much of what I do now on the patient as partner side came from exactly doing this. So this is where I followed my own advice. So I got into healthcare, and I went around and began to ask a lot of people in healthcare, including you, about kind of what you're doing and how we give a patient perspective into that. Well, that was all due to sort of this old sense of, let me just learn from people. I'm not trying to go and see if I can get a job and Dominic will pay me. I'm going
Right.
to start by just asking questions and see if I can understand what it is that you do, and maybe there are ways I could be helpful.
Yeah. We'll come back around to that in a little bit. So, and I know you don't like when you're working with someone with a student on this informational interviewing and trying to help them, you don't assign questions. But do you have any sort of examples just to give people some specific ideas for what type of things they might think about? Like if you're talking to someone about what they've done, they've been an architect, would you ask things like, well, tell me why you got interested in that or how you found yourself into being an architect?
Exactly. So I'll do it this way. What I'll often say to students, let me tell you what I would ask. This is not yours. These are not your. So again, if you really struggle, so I don't ever want to start there because it'll anchor you, right?
Yeah.
And I don't want to anchor students into something that, because they're really not being curious then. They're just repeating what they've done in school, which is teacher says to do this, and so I'll just follow and mimic them. So, but if they're really struggling, I might push a little on, okay, let me think about what I might ask. I might ask, so what matters to me is how my day goes. So I might ask them, like, what's the best day they've ever had being X profession? What's the worst day they've ever had? And
Hmm.
why were those two so different? Like what, and which one happens more frequently? Those kinds of questions. Or it might be, how did being a Bradley university, like what happened at Bradley that actually made your experience actually more or less powerful in what it is now? Is there something connecting what it means to be a Bradley alum and what it means to be an architect? Like what's the connection there? Um, so they're just things that get me to think about, advice they would give their sophomore. If I'm a sophomore, what they
Hmm.
would tell themselves if they
If
were a
they were a
sophomore
sophomore.
today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
That's great.
and you're writing all these things down in order to try to. So what I often say is, whatever your questions are, they need to be for something. Meaning, not. I mean, it's curious, but they're also trying to help you somehow. So if you're asking best worst days, it's because you know yourself that you'd be bored if their answer is, I sit in front of a computer all day, look at spreadsheets, run numbers, spit those back out, tell my boss about that. If in the end you say, I thought I'd liked it, but I don't like that idea. I don't
Yeah.
want to do
Right.
that for 6 hours. So you're trying to make this make sense to, I'm curious about what you do in order to inform myself about whether whether my values actually connect. And again, you do enough of these and you'll see the values of a profession sort of starts to come together, right? If we spent enough time, well, a good example is actually when we were together in Chicago at a bunch of physical therapists are together. you all begin to sound like each other,
Yep.
as you should, and the values that why your values sit, what it is you got into the field about, things that you're lamenting now that you wonder why that's the way the field is today, the
Hmm.
way you thought it was going to be. All of these things become part of the culture, and you'll either see yourself as a student like, oh, I'd fit there beautifully. I can't wait to get there, or
Right.
oh my God, those are not my people.
Yeah.
I'm not like that.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I think that's actually really smart. So questions that have a purpose, but they're not overly specific. They're more general. And what I assume is that as they do more of these, they actually get better at asking
You got
questions
it.
and are able to home in a little bit on where they want to go and what they want. So,
Well, and the feedback loop. So again, when I was doing this, the feedback loop would be to send kind of how it went with specific questions and get feedback. Like, what feedback do you want from me? So I've done a lot of these. I know a lot of people who've done a lot of these. So getting a text back and forth to say, I asked these kind of things and it really helped me to do this. I might probe like, well, how did it help you? Like, what are you
mm,
going to do with that now? So now you stumbled upon that they make $200,000 a year. Does that help you or hurt you in terms of thinking about what it is? What does that mean for you? So trying to get them to again stay curious as opposed to transactional in nature. Their goal is to keep learning, keep finding out new information.
yeah, no, that's actually great advice for the parents that are listening because then they can, I know you describe yourself as a questionologist, which I think should be obvious to people why you might do that at this point. But that's a great role that parents who are just working on this with their kids, they're working on this together, that the parents then can play that role of being chief questionologist, right? So they're talking to their kids. How are those interviews going? What have you learned? How was that conversation with this guy? And then they can just ask follow-up questions that keep with the goal being to keep them curious. And I
You
I
got it.
have to tie this in because I my head always goes here when something sort of pulls me down this lane, but you have referenced a couple times them being curious, them having their own questions. And it always makes me think of the whole point here is that they have to have their own path. It's not your path. It's not that they're going to follow somebody else's path, but they're getting information to follow their own path, which is very much a Joseph Campbell hero's journey sort of thing. If you're following somebody else's path, then you're not following your own path. You've got to chart your own course. And really, that's what this whole thing is about. It's just you're providing tools and information to help them identify different paths with more information so they can decide, okay, I think I need to go this way when I thought it was maybe over here, but actually this is more appealing for all the different types of reasons that you mentioned. Like, oh, sitting in front of a computer all day sounds awful. Like, I guess I don't actually really want to do that job. But this other guy or this other woman that I talked to, her thing was totally different and she's traveling around and it changes every day. And gosh, that sounds a lot more appealing to me.
You got it. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. That's certainly the goal. The other piece about this that we didn't talk about and this is actually it ties in it slightly differently. So the goal of this thing for me was to leverage what you talked about earlier of sort of being the first in your family to go to college. So what we did with this is try to actually make the opportunities available for all. So many sort of middle class, upper class kids would be fine if they never did this, right? They'll be okay. They'll come up with a wonderful career. They've got people who are connections, and all of that sort of works out. But what we were trying to do here is to build this so that if you, as a family, purchased some version of this program from us, we would then actually find a first generation college student or first in their family to go into trade school uh, and give them the same package that's being paid for by the family.
Oh, right, right.
And that link actually goes back to what you're saying. Sort of it expands the whole notion of opportunity, because that's for me what this is about, right? It's an opportunity for you to rethink how you can help yourselves and others. So it's a sort of buy one give one program that was intended to try to push us all. And if both parties agreed, they would actually go meet one another as well. So the person who got this opportunity to learn about this stuff, whose parents are not going to. So the ability for a parent who has not been formally educated is more challenging here, right? Because my mom, brilliant lady, in probably one of the smartest people I've ever met.
Hmm.
But her ability to actually sit down with me to talk about what we're talking about is limited because there's no access or opportunity to have ever done that.
Right, right.
So her as a parent is not going to be able to do that. But having if we'd have had a family and I was the kid who got this opportunity, what a great way to make this connection and build the community and connections even further.
Yeah. So just to clarify, so you have, let's say, a family, a more well-off family, comes to you and says, you know what, we want to do this with our daughter, and they pay you whatever the fee is. And then when they do that, you then find another potential or early college student like yourself who did not
Correct.
have the resources, the
Correct.
financial resources to pay for something like this, and you provide them the same opportunity,
Yep.
the same consulting, same
Yep.
counseling
Yep.
for free.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
Paid for
awesome.
by the other family. Right.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
if both agree, actually connect them so that there's a sense of, I actually did something for a kid we didn't know.
yeah.
A kid who really needs it, right? A kid who actually doesn't have the same opportunities as my kid.
Right.
Because when you ask their family, so again, that's often, I use much of my connections now because for that kid, um, they don't get to go home and say, oh, I think I want to be a dentist, or at least want to understand dental. Well, we don't know any dentists, and we didn't
Mm,
even go last year, right? So this
yeah,
is
right. Didn't go
these are
because
the
they
kind
couldn't
of
afford
things.
it.
Correct.
Yeah,
That's exactly right.
yeah, yeah. That's awesome. That's really fantastic, Greg. Before we wrap things up, why don't you, and it's not really sort of related to the FI thing, but it's still important, I think, just tell everyone a little bit about your work with Patient as Partner.
Yeah, and I'll happily come back to the FI thing because I actually think there's some pieces about FI that relates to this, not just tangentially, but actually I think that there's opportunities to, and I hadn't thought about it till we talked, opportunities to really think about the community of FI folks out there
Hmm.
and think about, well, what students could actually learn if they said, this is not even about a profession, this is about a way of living. And
Yeah.
so here's 10 people who actually understand this world. Why don't you go and explore that? So that's that. I think there's wonderful opportunities to make this connection to from quote unquote information interviewing to information interviewing with someone who is well entrenched in sort of the fire movement.
Well,
So
let's talk about that now. Then we'll wrap up with a little blurb on Patient as Partner before we close out. So what are your and that's great. I mean, and that whole idea of it's a way of living is very FI, right? FI is not, obviously it's about the financial knowledge and the financial tools and managing your money and knowing some things about investing, but you can't move towards financial independence at an age much earlier than traditional retirement without knowing what it is that really brings you joy in life, what you value, because you have to make choices, right? About where you're spending your money. And I know a lot of times people think, well, if I've got we're going to have a conversation coming up about with someone talking specifically about budgeting. And a lot of people think, well, if I've got a budget, then I can't have any fun. And that really just is not true. You just have to make choices. And so you don't have everything, but you don't get to have everything anyway, unless you're, some
right,
tech mogul. Um,
right.
so that makes perfect sense, actually, right? That these college students, as they're looking for what they want to do, because a lot of the FI movement, so people that have, unlike me, who knew about this or figured it out on their own when they were younger, have pulled off FI in when they're 30 or in their early 30s. So a lot of those people went to college, but they didn't spend money that they didn't need to spend on superfluous things. They were very clear on what they wanted to spend their money on. They had a high savings rate, which then they turned into investments. They worked hard at whatever their career was, did what they could to leverage that career to sort of make more money, but then that more money went into investing. And then they hit 30, 35, and then they're done. They don't have to work anymore. Now, that doesn't mean that they stop working and they never do anything again. Some of them continue working because they like what they do. Some of them have other interests. So, someone who, for example, really has a love of art or music as a musician, but was uncomfortable trying to make a living that way. Well, if they can achieve FI at 30 or 35, now if they want to really pour themselves into their art or their music or nonprofit organizations or whatever it is that lights them up, now they're free to do that because they don't have to earn money from it. And if they earn some extra money, great. But if they don't need to. So it really opens them up to pursue whatever it is that they really want to pursue that lights them up beyond just career. But early on, especially, they're very interrelated because you don't get to FI without having some sort of consistent income to move in that direction. And of course, the higher you can make your income, then the more you can save, the more you can invest, the quicker you can get to FI.
So
So
this, but for me, I'm curious, and I don't know enough, and we've talked a little about this, but I don't know enough about the movement to know about, for example, are there alumni networks across colleges that now exist?
I don't know if there are alumni networks across the colleges. I know that there are meetups, right? And there are groups online for different online communities. I know Choose FI, there's an online
Right.
space
But
and a
again, a
lot.
great way to sort of tie what we're talking about is exactly this, right? So
Yeah,
it may be that
absolutely.
FI actually goes back to alumni centers, says to folks, "Hey, we'd like to do a bagel coffee hour and meet any kid who wants to understand what it is." Like that might be a cool thing that
That's
somebody
super
wants to
cool.
do. To say, yeah, I want to go into all these places. I want to go meet these freshmen because we don't do enough of this stuff generally, and I want to tell you about what this is like. So I think there are opportunities to then make that same connection we were talking about around different career paths and information interviewing that is just around this, saying, yeah, you can extend this. So go feel free to talk to the architect who now is fully in the fire movement because they were done by 38.
Yeah.
You want to know about all that. You want to understand what it means to be an architect for 17 years, but you also want to know what's it like to actually have true financial independence. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So I think there's ways to make this intersection between how would I begin to learn about that, and even ways to actually for some of these kids to begin to think about the curiosity question. You know, the information interview that actually is around this. So you're not asking how much money do you make, but
Right.
you are asking what are the values that lead you to the life you have. And the more you had somebody on the professional side who really got this, you know, they understood it at 19 is when they were born into the movement. And again, they worked 20 years and now they really do live the life they want to live.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think there's opportunities here to tie these two things together. And it may be that you're bridging alumni centers to begin to think about this. Like they should care about this, right? So if I'm a college admission or alumni network, I want students to know about this because I want them to have the best life they want to have, the choices they make, the paths
Yes.
they set for themselves.
Yeah, sure.
Uh, and you know what I worry about. I mean, I talk about to many kids who've done information interviewing will come back and say these people seemed miserable. I don't want to be miserable, and that's
Mm,
partly they're handcuffed exactly the way you've described, right? They
forever
can't
trading
leave.
time for money.
That's all they're doing,
Yep.
and so they're miserable. And I don't
Yeah.
care what the profession is. It could be, you know, the biggest brain surgeon you've ever met in your life to you know, a person who is a plumber who hates the idea of going into one more toilet,
Yeah.
and yet they're stuck
Yeah,
because
that's
they
right.
have not. I mean, so both would be really. I mean, it's a nice way to bridge this in a way that I hadn't thought of until we actually were talking about it. So
Yeah. Well, we'll have to continue that conversation more because I hadn't thought of that either. But again, our conversations always lead to interesting places. So this is no exception. So that's great. So I want to think about that, and then I'm sure we'll talk more about it after the fact. Before we wrap up, just tell us a little bit about Patient as Partner because it's really cool what you're trying to do there. So
yeah, so I'll make this brief. So when I finish, so again, much of what you described earlier about this, what we talked about is transdisciplinary thinking, innovative ways to change fields. So I had this heart attack, sudden cardiac arrest, had this gifted second life, and I ended up in cardiac rehabilitation. and in that program was asked to be part of a patient family advisory council. And what typically happens in those things are they have patients to point out the flyers that they're giving and say, do you think that's a good flyer? And I began to think about this like, gosh, here's a thing that I wonder whether the stuff that I know about, which is building community in residence halls, how to get frightened 18-year-olds to actually get to know one another and connect with each other and find ways to build a community. I wonder if that could actually be, I assumed actually it already was leveraged in things like cardiac rehabilitation. And when I
Right.
learned that it wasn't, I thought, gosh, this is a role that lots and lots of patients could use use their lived experience and their other hats that they have in life to transform what is, in my view, a sort of broken healthcare system.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that is right now not nearly as there's much less humanity in human medicine than there should be. And so one way to begin to affect that is to invite patients to be partners in the challenges that exist in healthcare.
Yeah.
And so that's essentially where Patient is Partner was born, was to be able to say, that's what if I could think about the multitude of patients who have this wealth of lived experience, ask them to come in to partner with folks who are banging their head against the wall about everything from, we don't have enough people in our skilled nursing facility, and so if we don't have enough, this place is going to close. What are the ways in which we could? And we do this all on our own without actually asking the people who have been in that program, who've actually lived and got rehabilitated in a nursing facility. And so this is an opportunity to leverage that. So I started there in practice. So that's where Patient Partner started. I can tell you that it didn't continue partly because things like inertia really takes over in healthcare, and
Mm-hmm.
how we do things continue. You're on a hamster wheel and you just stay on the hamster wheel, and it's very, very, very hard to change. And there are almost no incentives to do what I'm just. Most people loved it, but the incentives to actually get something like that started and going is almost negligible for the administrative part of folks or the P&L people. And so it died off, and I felt really frustrated.
Yeah, it's
So
very,
I,
very challenging, right? Because we worked on this, right? I had you sort of consult with us when I was still working in healthcare, and we had a very forward-thinking organization, and still we made minimal progress because it's so hard. And healthcare tends to think we are patient focused. We're
of
patient-focused
course,
healthcare. And your whole point was, nah, not really. You're not involving the patients in nearly as many decisions and getting nearly as much feedback and suggestions about all kinds of things as you
correct.
would be, that just makes the experience for everyone, the provider and the patient, much better. But yeah, it's
Correct.
it's it's
So it's
very
an
challenging.
opportunity to really shift the whole ways in which we practice medicine. But because I couldn't get people, even people I loved like you, to move the
Hmm.
organization, because we're in a position to be able to say this is what we're going to do.
Yeah.
I've really shifted now to do much more work in research, where there are some incentives, right? So there now you actually have some funding agencies who will require that research to have patient partners from the very beginning. So that has
Oh,
shifted
okay.
my own focus, because if you can't align incentives to begin to make big changes, it's just so hard to move the boulder uphill.
Yeah.
But if you have funders who are willing to say, hey, inertia is going to be sped up, because we're going to say you can't actually get any funding unless you've got patient partners on your executive team, unless they've actually been part of the question formulation side, unless they've been part of your enrollment, unless they've been part of the dissemination. If you don't have patients who are partnering with you who are not enrolled in the trial, they're actually part of your team in making that actually work. So I've spent much, much more time now. In fact, the vast majority of my time is spent in healthcare research as opposed to practice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, but at least feel like you're having more of an impact now. I mean, it's a long-term game, it seems to me, right? So that's a research has to be done, that has to be published, studies put out before then changes are implemented. But at least
Well, I can actually see that in the horizon, right? So for me,
yeah.
I'm saying, okay, in this gifted second life, I don't know how long it's going to last,
Hmm.
but I actually can see that if we can get patients at the start of the question from this point forward all the way through to its dissemination, and they're partnering in that, we can at least begin to see that research will never be done the same again. In fact, I can envision a time 20 years from now when somebody will say, wait a minute, you mean we used to actually ask questions and patients weren't at the table when we were asking the research questions that mattered to them? That used to really happen. And so that's the hope I have, is that we'll get to a place where there'll be no research. All the way from sort of bench scientists who aren't asking questions to the people with whom they're trying to solve the problem, who have the lived experience, who say we co-created these questions together because they are what matters.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Okay, we should probably wrap things up there. Before we go, tell everyone where they can find you. So if anyone's got any questions, whether it's about the patient is partner and the research stuff, and obviously the informational interviewing, how can people find you?
So the easiest would be email would probably be my easiest connection, which is greg@patientispartner.com. Happily to take things there. That email is going to be active. And then there are two web pages. One is patientispartner.com, which will be the web page version is. And then I also have an informational-interviewing.com that will talk about kind of what we're trying to do with the buy one, give one program there and the things that we described. So you can point folks that way as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Greg. And I will include those links in the show notes. I'll also post some links on our website at fiforkids.com. So, Greg, as always, it's great conversation. I love talking to you. So, and yeah, I think this is a ton of useful information for our listeners out there. So thank you so much for coming on.
You bet. It's my pleasure. I love that we get to catch up in this format. So
yeah, cool. Thanks. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of the FI for Kids podcast. Please subscribe and follow the show. That helps get the word out to other parents and kids that are interested in pursuing their journey towards financial independence. And it also helps us continue to attract interesting guests. You can find contact info for our guests, as well as links for books and other resources in the show notes and at our website, fiforkids.com. Our intro music is provided courtesy of Douglas Cameron. You can find Doug's music at douglascameron.net, Spotify, Pandora, and Amazon Music. Our exit music is provided courtesy of the Zoo Human Project. You can find their music on Spotify and Pandora. You can also find them on Facebook. Thanks again, and we'll talk next week.
Life was once the standard of the day. Now most ride in the material plane. With art on the back burner and makeup in the microwave. How can a world full of flavor be so painfully bland? What should we do? Redefine value. Satiate the end of you. Oh, let the music move you. It's better late. It's better late than never. It's better late. It's better late to purify this polluted stream. Leave our suits on the bankside, let our souls get swept away. We'll empty out into the ocean and rise up under the rays of the sun. What should we do? Redefine value. appreciate the